My daughter-in-law told me the armchair was old and dusty, that it ruined the look of the room, that it belonged in a landfill. They didn't even ask, they just dragged it out to the curb. But it was in that very chair I had once rocked my grandson to sleep. They thought I'd shed a tear and forget. Instead, I went to the archive, opened a box I hadn't touched in 15 years, and pulled out everything that once saved their business. A month later, the IRS came knocking, and I simply sat back down in a new chair, sturdy, and mine. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Loretta Miller. I was 66 years old when everything changed, though it didn't happen suddenly. Change rarely does. It builds quietly, like dust, settling on things that used to matter. I had been retired for 8 years after working nearly 4 decades as a tax accountant in a mid-sized law firm in Portland, Oregon. I lived alone in a modest one-story home in Beaverton, the kind of neighborhood with trimmed hedges, familiar mailmen, and front porches that held more memories than furniture. I spent most of my days tending to my garden or visiting my son Jason's house in Lake Oswego. He had a young son, my grandson, Henry, who was 5 and still let me hold him without wriggling away. I cooked for them once a week, sometimes more. Christina, his wife, didn't cook much and worked long hours in real estate. She was sharp, impeccably dressed, always on her phone. I respected her hustle, even when she barely noticed I was in the room. In their house, tucked into the corner of the family room near the window, sat an old rocking chair. It was mine. I brought it with me the first time I ever watched Henry while they were both at work. It wasn't much to look at. Chipped white paint, worn arms, and a soft floral cushion that I'd replaced twice. But it was steady, sturdy, reliable. It had lived in my home for over 30 years, first bought at a thrift store when Jason was born. I had nursed him in it, held him through fevers and bad dreams. And when Henry came along, I brought it over without asking. I didn't think I needed permission to share a part of my story with my grandson. Every time I rocked Henry to sleep, I could feel the years between now and then folding into each other. The creak of the wooden runners against the floor was the same music I'd heard decades ago, only softer now, more fragile. It wasn't just a chair, it was time, made visible. When I visited, I always sat in that chair. It was my place. Christina never commented on it, never acknowledged its presence, but Jason would sometimes glance over when I sat and offer the smallest smile, like he knew, like he remembered. Or maybe he didn't, but he recognized something old and true, if only unconsciously. I didn't expect anyone else to understand what it meant to me, but I did expect it to be there, as long as I was. There were times, especially on quieter evenings, when I stayed late after dinner to help clean up. Christina would tap at her phone, flipping through listings or answering emails, while I cleared dishes and wiped down the counters. Jason would wrangle Henry into pajamas, and I'd steal a few last minutes in that chair. The room dim, the hum of their dishwasher filling the space. It was in that stillness, that gentle rocking rhythm, that I felt most myself. Not someone waiting to be included, not a guest, but a mother, a grandmother, a woman with history. That chair was the last piece of furniture I owned that came from the life I built with my late husband. Everything else had been donated, replaced, or given away over the years. But this one thing I kept. And when Jason started his family, I brought it with me, like a soft echo that refused to die out. It didn't match their modern home. I knew that. Their living room was sleek and curated, white walls, minimalist shelves, decorative vases that seemed more like suggestions than functional objects. My chair stood out like a misplaced relic, but I thought that made it beautiful. I never asked if they wanted it there. I assumed they'd tell me if they didn't. And for 5 years, no one did. So I let myself believe it was welcome. That belief was the only fragile thing about it. I had no way of knowing, not yet, that the quiet creak of that chair, the sound I'd associated with comfort and belonging, would soon be replaced by the sound of a trash can lid slamming shut. That something so full of my memories could be considered disposable. That something that had held the weight of my love could be tossed aside without a word. But that would come later. For now, I rocked gently, the sun setting beyond the trees, my fingers resting on the worn arms of the chair, and thought only of how lucky I was to still be part of something that felt like family, even if I was only just holding on by the runners. I arrived that afternoon like I always did, through the side door, carrying a pie in one hand and a folded grocery bag in the other. The kitchen smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something synthetic, like new paint or glue. Christina had been on a redecorating streak lately, updating the house one corner at a time. A new runner in the hallway, black and white family photos arranged in a precise grid along the stairs, and more throw pillows than any one family could possibly use. I didn't mind. It was her house, her taste. Still, I noticed immediately what was missing. The rocking chair. The corner by the window, where the light used to fall just right across the wooden slats, was empty. At first, I thought maybe it had been moved. I paused, scanning the room, expecting to see it somewhere else. Maybe shifted to another part of the house, out of the way for cleaning or some new layout. But it wasn't there. I waited, thinking someone would mention it. That Jason, seeing my eyes linger too long in that empty space, would speak. That Christina, with her efficient voice and clipped tone, would say it had been put in storage or moved to the garage. But neither of them said anything. Eventually, I asked, gently, casually, as if I were inquiring about a misplaced dish towel. Christina looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, we got rid of that old chair. It didn't really go with the new color scheme. It was kind of falling apart anyway." Then she went back to her screen. Jason didn't look at me. He was standing behind the kitchen island, sipping from a bottle of sparkling water, tapping one finger nervously on the granite counter. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. He just kept tapping. I placed the pie on the counter and stood for a moment longer, hands still full, unsure of where to put the silence now sitting between us. Christina began to talk about the new rug she ordered, how it had just arrived that morning, and how excited she was about the open feel of the living room now. She described it like she was talking about a magazine spread, clean lines, neutral tones, space to breathe. My chair had been clutter, a relic, something expendable. I didn't say anything. I nodded. I smiled in that tight way people do when they're trying not to show how deeply something has cut. Then I slowly walked into the living room and saw it for myself. Where my chair had been was now a tall potted plant, some expensive-looking thing with long leaves that drooped elegantly over a ceramic pot. Next to it was a modern side table with a lamp shaped like a sculpture, cold, curved, and impersonal. It was like my presence had been erased, smoothed over with gray and beige. The space no longer had corners where history could hide. Everything was symmetrical and silent. Even the couch had been replaced, now a long, low-profile sectional in cream. It looked like the kind of couch no one ever curled up on. A couch for looking at, not for living in. I didn't touch anything. I walked back to the kitchen, offered to help with dinner, and waited while Christina listed off ingredients she wanted chopped. Her voice was brisk, distant. Jason busied himself setting the table, careful not to look in my direction. When Henry came running into the room, I bent down to greet him, and for a moment the ache eased. He wrapped his arms around my legs and grinned up at me, his gap-toothed smile full of joy. I lifted him slightly, but even as I held him, I felt the absence of the motion, the soft, familiar back and forth that had once soothed him into sleep. My arms remembered the rhythm even if my body no longer had the chair to guide it. I wanted to ask where they had taken it, if it had gone to Goodwill, if someone had picked it up off the sidewalk, if it had made it to a dump, splintered and collapsed. I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because the answer would hurt either way. Dinner was quiet, not uncomfortable, just muted. Jason asked about my garden. Christina talked about work. Henry played with his food and asked if he could sleep over at my house soon. I told him maybe. I didn't look at his parents when I said it. When it was time to leave, I collected my things slowly, waiting to see if anyone would say more. They didn't. Christina hugged me quickly, already halfway into a conversation with someone on her Bluetooth. Jason walked me to the door. Still nothing. I stepped outside, felt the cold air press against my cheeks, and walked toward my car with a strange weight in my chest. Not anger, not even sadness, something heavier and less defined. It was the feeling of being quietly removed, of watching a piece of your life vanish under the polite disguise of home improvement. They had taken away a chair, yes, but also the memory it carried, the meaning it held. They hadn't asked, they hadn't warned me. And maybe that was what hurt the most, not the loss itself, but the assumption that it wouldn't matter. The next morning, I made a pot of coffee that I didn't really want. I let it sit in the carafe as I stood by the window, watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the fence. The sun had barely crested over the rooftops, and yet I felt like I had been awake for hours. Sleep hadn't offered much, just a restless loop of memories, questions, and the dull ache of being pushed out without a word. I didn't cry. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was older than that, an exhaustion that came from being quietly disregarded again and again until the thread finally snapped. It had nothing to do with furniture. It had to do with erasure, with the slow, deliberate removal of presence, memory, and meaning. I went down to the basement. It was cold and smelled faintly of old paint and cardboard. A single bulb hung overhead, casting a cone of light that barely reached the far corners. I hadn't been down there in months. The shelves were cluttered with boxes, holiday decorations, my husband's old fishing gear, mason jars that hadn't seen jam in a decade. I moved slowly, brushing off cobwebs and shifting boxes until I found the one I was looking for. It was a plain file box, gray, worn at the edges. I had labeled it years ago in black marker, Business Records, LM. No one else would have thought it important. It looked like any other box filled with tax receipts or appliance manuals, but I knew what was inside. I carried it upstairs, set it on the kitchen table, and opened it with the care of someone unsealing the past. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, arranged by year, each one holding the story of how I had helped Jason build his business from scratch. Before Christina, before the company name changed, before the expansion. When he was just a young man with ambition and a head full of spreadsheets he didn't know how to use. There were copies of checks I had written, startup capital, bridge loans, tax payments when their books ran short, not gifts, loans, agreements that were never signed because we were family. But I kept the records anyway, not because I expected anything in return, but because I was a bookkeeper by instinct, and I knew how quickly memories could be rewritten. There were notarized letters from our banker at the time, acknowledging my collateral on their first office space lease. I had offered my retirement account as security so he could secure lower interest. It wasn't a favor, it was a risk. One I had taken with eyes wide open because I believed in him. I found the original LLC registration. My name was listed as a partial owner, not just in title, but in function. It hadn't been amended, not legally. No documents had ever removed me. I still held that ownership, silently, dormant. But there, in black and white, I ran my hand over the pages and felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Not bitterness, not triumph, but resolve. This wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. I had been written out of the story while still holding half the chapters. In the bottom of the box, beneath the paperwork, was a small folder of photographs. Jason at the ribbon cutting of his first storefront, Christina standing awkwardly beside him, not yet used to the cameras, me in the background, holding Henry as a baby, standing beside my rocking chair, which we had temporarily moved into their office during that first hectic year. It had been part of the business once, too. I closed the folder and sat quietly for a moment. The room was still. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past without stopping. I listened to the sound fade before I moved again. I gathered the documents I needed, the most relevant ones: the LLC registration, bank letters, loan statements, tax filings. I placed them in a clean manila folder and clipped them together in order. Then I made copies, 3 full sets. I knew where they needed to go. Later that day, I called my attorney. He was an old colleague from my working years, now semi-retired, but still sharp, and still grateful for the referrals I'd sent his way. I told him I wasn't planning to sue. Not yet. But I wanted to know what my legal standing was. I wanted to prepare. I also called the CPA I trusted. I asked him to review the business's recent filings, just in case, just to see if anything looked off. I didn't say why. He didn't ask. I wasn't building a case. I was remembering my place in the foundation. They had treated me like a relic, like old furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic. But what they hadn't realized was that the house they stood in, the business they ran, the comfort they lived in, had been partially constructed with my hands, my time, and my name. They didn't have to say thank you, but they didn't get to pretend I was never there. That box in my basement had never held just paper. It held history. And if they had forgotten, I had not. Some things aren't sentimental. Some things are legally binding. For the next several days, I said nothing. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't stop by. I let the silence stretch out between us like a drawn curtain, one they didn't bother to pull back. I imagined they thought I was sulking, letting my feelings get the better of me. They had no idea that beneath the surface of that quiet, something had already begun to shift. The documents I pulled from the basement were no longer just historical curiosities. They were pieces of a structure, evidence of threads they had long ago stopped seeing but never cut. The same threads they now tried to erase with design choices and silence. I spent my days slowly and deliberately, like someone winding a clock. I reviewed every folder, labeled new copies, and typed up a timeline of all the financial and legal ties I still had to their business. The more I assembled, the clearer the picture became. They weren't just careless, they were exposed. Every night, I drank my tea by the window, watching headlights drift across the street like ghosts. The sky darkened earlier now. Autumn was beginning to brush the tips of the trees with yellow. The air smelled like smoke and fallen leaves. It was the kind of season that always made me think about endings. The neighborhood was quiet. My neighbors waved, but no one stopped to talk. I preferred it that way. I needed time to think, to remember, to plan. One afternoon, I received a voicemail from Christina. Her voice was flat, professional. She thanked me for the pie and said Henry had asked about me. Then she asked, as if as an afterthought, if I might want to pick him up from school sometime next week. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to see Henry, but because I wasn't going to walk back into that house like nothing had happened. Jason didn't call at all. I wasn't surprised. That was his pattern. Wait for the dust to settle, then pretend the breeze never blew through in the first place. I'd seen it before with his father, with old friends, with jobs. Discomfort made him disappear. But I wasn't dust, and this storm wasn't over. A few days later, I had my meeting with the CPA. He sat across from me at a tidy conference table in a downtown office with large windows and metal chairs that looked more stylish than comfortable. He read through my file without speaking, then slowly looked up at me. He told me I had reason to be concerned. He explained that several filings made by Jason's company over the past 5 years listed structures and ownership claims that didn't match the documents I still held. He showed me inconsistencies, depreciation claims, misreported ownership, deductions that shouldn't have been taken, sloppy work, possibly illegal, possibly just reckless, but definitely risky. I asked him to write a formal summary, just a short memo. Nothing too aggressive, just enough to be noticed. Then I mailed that summary, anonymously, to the Oregon Department of Revenue. I didn't want to burn the house down. I only wanted them to smell the smoke. The following Monday, I walked to the post office and sent a second package. This one was addressed to the IRS whistleblower office. Inside were copies of my ownership documents and a brief letter outlining my relationship to the company. I included my contact information. I wasn't hiding. I had no way of knowing how quickly things would unfold. Tax investigations aren't storms. They're slow, creeping floods. But the first drop had landed. Back at home, I dusted the shelves. I opened the windows and let the cold air in. I rearranged the living room, moving the lamp from the left side of the couch to the right. I replaced the throw blanket with one I'd knitted last winter. I ordered a new chair online, modern, but with a curved base, something that could still rock. It wasn't sentimental, but it would be mine. Each of these small acts felt like a reclamation. They had thought my silence was weakness. It wasn't. It was calculation. There is a silence that waits and a silence that watches. I was no longer waiting. I was watching the storm I had summoned take shape on the horizon. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared. The first call came from Jason. I didn't answer. I watched the phone ring twice, then drop into silence, then ring again a few minutes later. I knew the pattern. When he didn't get a response, he followed it with a text. Short, no punctuation, just, "Can we talk?" Not a question, not even a plea, just a placeholder. Something to make contact without having to say the words that would cost him pride. I didn't respond. It took 2 more days before I heard from Christina. Her number lit up my screen while I was in the middle of folding laundry. I let it go to voicemail. I stood perfectly still in the quiet hum of my house, letting the soft clatter of the dryer finish its cycle. Then I played her message. She sounded tight, brittle, her usual gloss stripped away. She asked if I had heard anything, said that someone from a government office had reached out with questions about the company's tax filings. She said they were doing a routine review, but her voice betrayed something else. Panic, maybe. Or the realization that a routine review only looks routine until someone starts asking the wrong questions. She didn't accuse me, but the implication hung in the space between every sentence. I didn't delete the message. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and pulled out the folder I had already begun updating. I added new dates to the log I'd kept, printed the emails confirming receipt of my submissions. I labeled everything with bright orange tabs. They had always assumed I was too sentimental to be strategic. What they didn't understand was that sentimentality had nothing to do with disorganization. I loved deeply, but I filed everything. I remembered every detail. I saved every copy, and the documents hadn't burned. When I had offered my savings to help them launch the company, I was cautious. I knew the risks. I had insisted we keep everything clean, structured, documented. Jason hadn't cared. He was in a rush to get the business off the ground. Christina hadn't paid attention. She was too busy drawing up marketing plans and shopping for furniture for an office they hadn't leased yet. I handled the paperwork. I always had. And now, that paperwork was coming back with weight. I knew from my time in finance how investigations unfolded. I knew that once the first inconsistency was discovered, it would trigger a chain reaction: asset reviews, partner breakdowns, audits of supplier payments. They would try to stall, delay, explain, but paper doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. Jason finally came to the house on a Thursday afternoon. He knocked twice, waited, then rang the bell. I watched him through the window for a moment before opening the door. He looked tired, not unkempt. He was still wearing one of his tailored shirts, still polished, but his face had aged in the span of a week. There was something hollow in his eyes. He asked to come in. I let him. We sat at the table like we had so many times before, years ago when he was still young and scared, building something from nothing and asking if I thought it would work. Back then, he had listened. He had trusted me. Somewhere along the way, that trust had warped into assumption. He asked if I'd been contacted by the IRS or anyone else. I told him the truth. Yes. He didn't get angry, not visibly. Instead, he deflated, shoulders dropping, eyes scanning the surface of the table as if searching for a way back into the version of the world where I was still just his backup plan. He said Christina was furious, that she felt blindsided, that the board of investors was getting nervous, that they might freeze assets. I listened. Then I reminded him gently that none of this would be happening if anyone had asked, before throwing away things that weren't theirs to discard. I didn't mention the chair. I didn't need to. We both knew that moment had been the match on a long line of paper waiting to ignite. He asked what I wanted. It was the first time he had asked me that in years, and the answer was simple. I wanted him to remember, not just what I had done, but who I had been, what I had built, what I had saved, what I had signed. He left with a copy of the original partnership agreement. I watched him walk to his car with it tucked under his arm, like a fragile truth he'd just now realized had always belonged to me. That night, I sat in my new rocking chair. It creaked differently, new wood, new weight, but the rhythm was the same. I watched the trees shift in the wind, the same way they had when I rocked Jason through teething fevers and schoolyard heartbreaks. The paper trail I had left behind was never meant to be a weapon, but it had become a shield, and it had held. It had been a quiet day, a slow one. I was sitting in the kitchen sorting through old cookbooks, trying to decide which ones I still used and which ones I was finally ready to part with. I had just placed a worn binder of handwritten recipes into the keep pile when I heard the knock on the door. It was soft, hesitant. I opened it and saw Jason standing there with his shoulders slightly hunched, holding nothing, saying nothing. He looked different, not just tired, but diminished. smaller, as if something had been pulled out of him and he hadn't yet figured out how to fill the space it left behind. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked slowly, like a man approaching a confession rather than a conversation. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of my kitchen, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor like the tiles could offer him an escape route. He started talking in that low, steady voice people use when they're trying not to fall apart. He said there had been a meeting, that the board had concerns, that Christina had screamed at him in the parking lot after she found out the extent of what was happening, that they were now considering dissolving the company to avoid a formal audit. He paused after each sentence, waiting for me to respond. I didn't. I let him speak. He said he didn't know how bad it had gotten, that he trusted Christina to handle the filings, that he thought everything was in order, that he never meant to shut me out, that he thought I was just being quiet about things, that he never expected this. Then he stopped talking altogether and stared at the floor. I watched him for a long time. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. It gave weight to the things he wasn't saying, the apologies he hadn't found the language for, the guilt he didn't know how to wear, the shame he hadn't expected to feel. He had always been proud, always convinced he was steering the ship. And maybe he had been. But somewhere along the way, he had started confusing control with care, authority with love, and success with immunity. He forgot that the people who help you build are just as important as the structure itself. I offered him a chair. He sat, finally, still looking down. I didn't lecture him. I didn't tell him how hurt I'd been. He already knew. I could see it in the way he couldn't meet my eyes, in the way he kept wringing his hands together like a boy who knew he'd broken something he couldn't fix. He said Christina had moved out temporarily, that she was staying with a friend, that she said she couldn't be part of something that was collapsing. That word, collapsing, hung between us like smoke. I poured him some tea even though he didn't ask. He held the cup without drinking, stared into it as though it could reflect a version of himself he hadn't destroyed. Then, very quietly, he asked what he was supposed to do now. I could have said 1,000 things. I could have told him to hire a better attorney, to renegotiate the contracts, to accept the audit and make things right. But none of that was what he really wanted to know. What he wanted was absolution, a signal that things could go back to how they were, but they couldn't. So instead, I told him the truth, that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought was yours to understand what actually matters. That sometimes the only way to rebuild is to start with the foundation you ignored. That I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't going to step back into the shadows either. I told him I still loved him, that nothing would change that. But I also told him I wouldn't pretend nothing had happened. He nodded slowly, still staring at the floor. When he finally stood up, I saw something shift in his face. A recognition, maybe even a kind of peace, not the kind that comes with resolution, but the kind that comes with understanding the damage done. He hugged me, not tightly, not desperately, just long enough. Then he left. I watched him walk down the front steps and into the dusk. The porch light flicked on behind him. He didn't look back. Back inside, I folded the rest of the laundry and turned off the kitchen light. The silence that followed didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a closing chapter. The days that followed were the quietest I had experienced in years. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, not the soft hush that comes with early mornings or a gentle snowfall. This quiet was dense and watchful. It filled the house like a second presence, and I felt it press against me whenever I moved from room to room. There were no more knocks at the door, No more phone calls, no more questions, only silence, thick as fog. Jason didn't come back. I heard things secondhand. A message from a friend who worked at the courthouse, a neighbor who'd seen Christina moving boxes out of the house, a former co-worker who sent me a link to a financial blog speculating about the company's sudden stall. They didn't mention names, but I recognized the language. I knew the signs. The business was unraveling, slowly, deliberately, and out in the open. I didn't gloat. I didn't even feel satisfied. What I felt more than anything was clarity. I had spent so long in the background, smoothing rough edges, solving problems before anyone else noticed they existed. Now I watched as the problems I had once protected them from surfaced, and there was no one left to shield them. Christina filed for divorce. It didn't make the news, but it traveled fast among those who cared to know. I wasn't surprised. She had always been strategic, and when she realized the fallout might stick to her, she pulled away. Her timing was precise, her departure complete. She left Jason standing in the wreckage with his name on all the documents and none of the defenses. I thought about calling him. More than once I picked up the phone and hovered over his name. But I didn't press the button. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because I knew this was something he had to sit with, alone. He had to feel the full weight of it. Not just the business losses, not just the marriage, but the years of assumption, of erasing people who built the things he now mourned. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with funerals. The grief of realizing what you had and didn't protect. That kind lingers longer. It seeps in through the walls and wakes you in the middle of the night. I spent those days caring for the things that were mine. I planted bulbs in the backyard, knowing they wouldn't bloom for months. I oiled the wood on my new rocking chair and rearranged the books on my shelves. I baked bread and left it wrapped on neighbors' porches. I listened to classical music in the evenings. I wrote a list of places I still wanted to visit, and I pinned it to the inside of the kitchen cabinet, just behind the mugs. I lived like someone who had reclaimed time. One afternoon, Henry came to visit. Christina dropped him off without coming to the door. He ran inside like nothing had changed, laughing and dragging a stuffed dinosaur by the arm. I scooped him up and held him close. He didn't ask about his father. He didn't ask about the house. He only asked if I could make pancakes for dinner and if he could rock in my new chair. I said yes to both. We sat together as the sun dipped behind the trees. He rocked back and forth with a soft hum, the same way Jason used to when he was small. It wasn't the same chair, but the rhythm was familiar. My body remembered how to hold love, even if the setting had changed. Later that evening, after I tucked Henry into bed, I sat alone by the window with a cup of tea. The sky was deep blue, and the wind stirred the trees with that slow, thoughtful motion I always loved. I thought about the word consequence. It's often framed as punishment, but it isn't. It's just the end of the thread. The result of choices laid down over years, woven into fabric you don't recognize until it's pulled taut. Jason was now sitting in that space, alone, no doubt, sorting through what was left, looking not at the future, but at the pieces of the past he hadn't thought he'd need again. I didn't hate him. I didn't even pity him. I just let him be where he was. Because sometimes the only teacher left is silence. And sometimes the only healing comes from being broken in a way that forces you to rebuild something truer. And that's not something anyone can do for you. It was Sunday morning, the kind that begins softly, with light filtering through gauzy curtains and the scent of sleep still lingering in the air. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I had nowhere to be, and for once that was entirely true. The kettle began its familiar whistle just as I reached the stove, and I poured the water into my favorite mug, the chipped one with the faded lavender rim, the one that had survived more moves and arguments than any cup ever should have. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and a slice of whole wheat toast, buttered just right, letting the warmth settle into my palms. The newspaper lay nearby, still folded in half, untouched. I didn't feel the need to read about the world that morning. My world had already shifted. Outside, a thin autumn wind rattled the branches of the maple tree in the backyard, sending yellow leaves twirling onto the grass like delicate reminders of time moving forward. For the first time in years, my calendar was empty, my mind unburdened. There were no birthdays to plan, no dinners to prepare, no errands tied to anyone else's needs, just the steady rhythm of my breath, the gentle tick of the wall clock, and the creak of the floor beneath my slippers. The silence in the house didn't press down on me the way it used to. It didn't remind me of absence. It reminded me of choice. I had stopped waiting, waiting to be included, waiting to be seen, waiting to be asked how I was, what I needed, what I remembered. Somewhere along the way, I had trained myself to think of invisibility as virtue. I had been praised for my ability to adapt, to accommodate, to stay silent. And for a time, I believed that meant strength. But there is a difference between grace and erasure. It's subtle. It creeps in slowly. When people stop asking your opinion, when they make decisions for you, when they throw away what you love and call it clutter, when they treat your life like something to be rearranged for convenience, when they don't ask because they've already decided your answers don't matter. They didn't ask me what that chair meant. They didn't ask if I wanted to keep it, if I still saw something sacred in the curve of the wood, in the fabric worn soft by years of holding children, of holding grief. They didn't ask because they thought they knew better. So I answered in the only way I could, not with arguments, not with raised voices, but with paper, with numbers, with copies of documents they had forgotten existed, with my name written in places they had stopped looking. I didn't raise my hand. I raised the curtain. I showed them what they had overlooked. And now the silence had shifted. Not the silence in my house. That was still peaceful, still mine. But the silence between us. They didn't call. They didn't text. Jason had retreated into whatever space he needed to process the consequences of casual disregard. Christina had vanished completely, as if the whole mess had been an inconvenience she could simply walk away from. Only Henry came around, sweet, curious Henry. He didn't ask about the rocking chair. He just sat in the new one beside me, feet swinging, head resting lightly against my arm. With him, there was no need for explanation. He still knew how to live in the present without needing to rewrite the past. I had started writing again, not for anyone else, for myself. Letters to the younger version of me, the girl who gave away too much in the name of peace. I wrote to her about forgotten documents and sudden storms, about how it's never too late to stand up by sitting still. I wrote to her about the truth I had come to know, that silence is only noble when it's chosen, not when it's expected. I wrote pages. I answered questions no one had asked. What mattered to me? What had I sacrificed? What had I kept? Every word on the page was a reclamation, not of power, but of self. I even framed an old photograph I'd kept tucked in the back of a drawer for decades. Jason as a toddler, asleep in my lap, his tiny fists curled into my sweater, my hand cradling the back of his head. We were both younger then, before the roles shifted, before the lines blurred. I placed it on the mantel beside a small vase of dried lavender, a quiet altar to the parts of my life that still felt whole. That afternoon, I settled into my new rocking chair. The wood creaked in a way that was unfamiliar but comforting. My tea rested on the side table, still warm. A blanket covered my legs, soft and heavy, woven by hand. The light outside was gold, bending through the trees like something out of a memory. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. I didn't need a stage or an apology. I didn't need my name etched in stone. I had found peace in knowing that I hadn't vanished. I had simply stopped waiting for others to recognize me. I had recognized myself. I was no longer a supporting character in a story someone else was telling. I was the writer, the keeper, the one who answered even when no one asked. And I had answered in the only language that cannot be ignored: action.